Okay, so you really want to understand something, right? Like really get to the bottom of it without getting lost in, you know, all the noise.
Yeah, completely.
Well, then you've definitely come to the right place. Today we're heading to the middle of nowhere. Well, not exactly, but to the heart of Australia to discover something amazing
Mm.
in Australian overland travel.
Right. Yeah. And we're not just talking about like the typical touristy stuff. No offense to the typical
You're
tourist.
right, of course not.
But we are going to go deep and really understand what makes crossing this massive continent so interesting.
Exactly. We want to go beyond just like, you know, pretty pictures. We're going to unlock those deeper stories about Australian culture, especially those from the Indigenous people.
Yeah, their history is so incredible.
Plus, we'll uncover how history has shaped the routes and those little known surprising facts that you just can't forget.
They really do stick with you.
They really do. So if you're the kind of person who likes to connect the dots of history and culture and loves a good story, well, Australian Overland Travel has a lot to offer.
It really does.
So let's jump right in. What's driving this huge interest in Australian overland travel? Why are people, especially young folks, ditching those well-worn tourist paths for these long and sometimes tough journeys?
I think it's this desire for something real, you know, something more than just a typical vacation. People want authentic experiences, a connection to the land. It's about this craving for adventure that goes deeper than just checking off landmarks on a list.
Yeah, it's more than just a photo op at Uluru, isn't it?
Hmm.
Our sources really highlighted this idea of connecting deeply with Australia's diverse cultures, almost like these journeys feed your soul.
Yeah, like it makes your soul happy.
That sounds a little poetic, maybe, but true.
It is. And if we think about this more broadly, a lot of these overland routes go through what one source called the heartbeat of the land. Think
Uh-huh.
about the Gibb River Road or the Oodnadatta Track. These aren't just scenic drives, they go through landscapes that are super connected to the Aboriginal concept of the dreaming.
The dreaming, okay, so for folks who aren't familiar with that, can you give us like a quick explainer on what that is?
Yeah. The dreaming is a complex system that ties together all of Aboriginal life. It explains how everything is connected through stories and beliefs that have been passed down for generations.
Okay, so by traveling these routes, you're not just seeing the landscape, but you're experiencing these foundational stories embedded in the land itself.
Exactly. And it leads to some amazing cultural interactions, as some sources call them. Overland travel creates these unique opportunities to engage with Indigenous communities in ways that are much deeper than a quick tour stop.
So we're talking about actually participating in traditional ceremonies, learning about bush tucker, the native foods that have been around for centuries, and really grasping that spiritual bond between Aboriginal cultures and the land.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember the eco-adventure aspect that our sources mentioned.
Eco-adventures, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
These trips, when done respectfully, can really help promote sustainable travel. They can teach you how to minimize your environmental footprint, support local economies along the way.
So it's about being mindful of the impact you're having on these less traveled paths.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's this combination of adventure, authentic cultural immersion, and mindful exploration that's making Australian overland journeys so appealing. But this desire to really connect with a place, it's not new, is it? Let's dig into the history that shaped these journeys over thousands of years. I mean, hitting the outback in a four-wheel drive didn't just happen overnight, right?
Not at all. The historical context here is what's so fascinating.
Yeah, definitely.
Modern overland travel in Australia sits on top of layers and layers of history, starting with those ancient pathways created by Indigenous Australians over 65,000 years ago. Their understanding of the land was just incredible.
And it wasn't just like random trails. These were carefully planned routes for trade cultural exchange routes refined and used for generations. Then European explorers came along, and they often relied on this indigenous knowledge, sometimes acknowledging it, sometimes not.
Yeah, that's a really important point. One source specifically mentioned explorers like Burke and Wills. Their attempts to chart the continent in the 1800s show just how hard it was, and how important Aboriginal guides were for their survival, even when they weren't always respected.
Yeah, it really highlights how important local knowledge is in such unfamiliar landscapes.
It does. It's a lesson we can still learn from today, you know? Be
The,
humble and learn from those who know the land best.
the Burke and Wills expedition has become almost legendary for its tragic ending. Can you remind us what made it so significant when talking about early overland travel?
It's a powerful example of what can go wrong when you don't understand the Australian outback. Despite all their resources, Burke and Wills didn't understand the climate or the terrain, and their bad relationship with local indigenous people ultimately led to tragedy.
It's a stark reminder that these overland routes weren't empty spaces waiting to be discovered, but already well known and traveled by the Aboriginal custodians of the land. Our sources also talk about the outback pioneers. Who were they, and how do they fit into this history of overland travel?
These were the tough guys, the drovers and stockmen who moved huge herds of cattle across vast distances, especially in the 1800s and early 1900s. Their journeys were hard and often dangerous, but their stories became a big part of Australian culture.
So from those ancient trade networks to those epic cattle drives, there's this ongoing story of people moving across the land, overcoming huge challenges, and leaving their mark.
Exactly, and that brings us to those surprising and kind of mind-blowing facts that we
I
promised.
love a good "you won't believe this" moment. Speaking of pioneers and their challenges, one of the lasting legacies is something truly incredible.
Absolutely. Australian overland travel is full of surprises. Take the dingo fence, for example. Did you know it's the longest fence in the world?
The longest fence in the world. Okay.
Over 5,600 kilometers stretching across the outback.
Wow, that's longer than some countries.
Right. And it's not just a fun fact, it shows how much humans have changed the Australian ecosystem and the challenges of managing such a vast land.
So what was the original purpose of building something so massive? It's hard to even imagine.
It was built to keep dingoes, wild dogs away from farmland, mostly to protect sheep. Today, some people question how effective it really is, but it's still an incredible landmark that travelers come across.
A fence that stretches to the horizon, that's a story to tell. What other surprises does the Australian landscape hold?
Well, there's the Nullarbor Plain. It might not sound too exciting. It literally means no trees, and it is this huge, flat, treeless area. But in this seemingly boring landscape, there's something amazing. The longest straight stretch of railway track in the world.
A perfectly straight railway for who knows how long. That sounds surreal.
It really is, and it makes you think differently about what a journey across a continent can be like. Speaking of adapting to harsh environments, our sources talked about the opal mining towns with Coober Pedy as a prime example.
Ah, Cooper Petty. Yeah, I've heard of that. It's on the Stewart Highway, a major route for north-south travel, right? What's so special about it?
Because of the extreme heat in the outback, a lot of people in Coober Pedy live underground. They have underground homes, shops, even churches. It's an amazing example of human ingenuity and a unique stop for anyone traveling through that part of Australia.
Living underground to beat the heat, that's not your average town. It just shows how these journeys can lead you to the most unexpected places and stories. To wrap things up, our sources gave us a timeline of Australian overland travel. Can we go through that to get a clearer picture of how it all evolved?
Absolutely. It's a helpful way to understand what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
First, we have the ancient pathways created by Indigenous Australians over thousands and thousands of years. These were vital for trade communication and culture way before Europeans arrived.
So these weren't just simple paths, they were like the backbone of the continent.
Exactly. Then, in the 1800s, we have European exploration. This was a time of risky expeditions trying to map the continent. As we talked about, those explorers often relied on indigenous knowledge to find their way.
A time of big ambitions, but also a lack of understanding and respect for the knowledge that had been there for centuries.
That's right. Then in the 20th century, we see the rise of modern overland travel. Stronger vehicles, especially four-wheel drives and better roads, made these remote trips easier, leading to a surge in interest.
So the arrival of reliable off-road vehicles really opened up parts of the country that were nearly impossible to reach before.
Yeah, it did. And finally, in the 21st century, we see a cultural revival. There's a growing respect for indigenous culture and a focus on sustainable travel, which is making these overland journeys even more meaningful.
So it's a tradition that keeps evolving, building on its deep history, but also changing with our values and understanding. And what's the main takeaway from all of this? What's the most important thing to remember about Australian overland travel?
I think the key point is that Australian overland travel is this amazing mix of adventure, deep cultural learning, and being mindful of the environment. It's not just about the distance you cover, it's about connecting with different cultures and getting a real understanding of Australia's rich heritage.
It sounds like a journey that connects you to the land,
Mhm.
the history, and the spirit of the people.
Right. It needs a different mindset. You have to be ready for anything and open to learning from the land and its people.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Australian overland travel, it's clear there's so much more to it than just dirt roads and pretty views.
Absolutely.
It's a journey through time, culture, and some truly unique places.
And remember, this is just the beginning. There are countless stories and experiences waiting to be found along those less traveled paths.
That's a great point. And it brings me to my final thought for you, our listener. Think about this. Given all that ancient knowledge within these overland routes, knowledge that Indigenous Australians have held for thousands of years, how can that wisdom help us today? How can it inform our understanding of sustainable living and our connection to the places we live? It's a question that goes beyond just the Australian outback, don't you think?
I think
It
so.
applies to all of us.
Yeah.